The iron gates are locked. They've been locked for decades, rusted into place by winters that no one bothered to count. Beyond them, through the bare trees of a January twilight, you can just make out the silhouette, a mansion that doesn't quite fit. Too many towers. Too many strange angles. Windows shaped like keyholes and doorways that seem to lead nowhere. This is the Olcott Estate, and if you stand here long enough, in the cold and the silence, you start to feel that the house is watching you back. Most people drive past without noticing. It sits on a hill outside Ridgefield, Connecticut, hidden behind overgrown laurel and collapsing stone walls. There's no historical marker, no tourist sign. The locals know it's there, but they don't talk about it much. When they do, it's in careful, sideways language. The old Olcott place. That weird mansion up on the ridge. You know, the one with all the symbols. But this house was not always forgotten. Once, it was the crown jewel of one of America's most powerful railroad fortunes. It was built by a man who controlled thousands of miles of track, who dined with presidents and bankrolled senators, who could move markets with a telegram. His name was Cornelius Thaddeus Olcott, though history has worked hard to forget him. And this mansion, this labyrinth of hidden rooms and coded doorways, was his temple, his obsession, his ruin. Because behind the marble columns and the manicured gardens, behind the dinner parties and the philanthropic galas, Cornelius Olcott was conducting a different kind of business. He was a member of a secret society, one that believed in hidden masters, astral planes, and the power of ancient knowledge. He built this estate not just as a home, but as a shrine to those beliefs. He carved symbols into the walls. He constructed underground chambers lit by oil lamps in patterns that mimicked the stars. He held rituals in rooms that guests never saw. And when it all came crashing down, when the federal investigators arrived with warrants and ledgers, when the family fortune evaporated in a cascade of fraud and scandal, the mansion was left behind like a stage set after the final act. Locked, sealed, slowly devoured by time. But here's the thing about secrets. They don't disappear just because you walk away. They wait. In 2003, during a partial restoration effort funded by a historical preservation group, workers broke through a false wall in the mansion's east wing. Behind it, they found a room. Not a closet, not a storage space, a room. 15 feet by 20. No windows. A single door hidden behind paneling that had been painted over so many times it looked like part of the wall. Inside, filing cabinets, leather-bound journals, maps covered in handwritten annotations, and documents bearing the seals of banks that no longer exist. The preservation group handed everything over to the state archives. Most of it was eventually cataloged. Some of it was scanned and made available to researchers. But a significant portion, no one will say exactly how much, was never released. Citing privacy concerns, ongoing legal complexities, and the sensitive nature of the materials, the state simply locked it away again. So the question isn't just what Cornelius Olcott built in that mansion on the hill. The question is why, and what he was so desperate to hide that, more than a century later, we're still not allowed to see it. If you enjoy deep investigations into the hidden lives of America's elite, the power, the secrets, the things they built, and the costs they buried, then this is the channel for you. We go beyond the surface. We ask the uncomfortable questions. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you want more stories like this one. Because this is just the beginning. Now, let's go back to where it started. To the Gilded Age. To the railroads. To a young man with too much money, too much ambition, and a hunger for something the material world couldn't satisfy. Cornelius Thaddeus Olcott was born in 1851 in Albany, New York, into a family that already had one foot in the world of industrial power. His father, Thaddeus Sr., had made a modest fortune in shipping and lumber, enough to send his son to Yale and to secure him a position in the rapidly expanding railroad industry. But Cornelius wasn't content with modest. He was brilliant, ruthless, and lucky, three qualities that, in the 1870s, could turn a man into a king. By the age of 30, he had consolidated control over a network of regional rail lines stretching from New York to Chicago. By 35, he was negotiating with J.P. Morgan. By 40, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, a name whispered in the same breath as Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. But something was wrong. Colleagues noticed it first. Cornelius had always been intense, driven, but now he seemed distracted. He would disappear for weeks at a time, claiming business in Europe or the West Coast, only to reappear with strange books under his arm, texts on theosophy, Eastern religion, occult philosophy. He began hosting private salons at his New York townhouse, inviting spiritualists, mystics, and self-proclaimed masters of hidden knowledge. His wife, Eleanor, tried to intervene. His business partners grew concerned. But Cornelius was too powerful to be stopped by worry or decorum. In 1889, he announced his intention to build a new estate. Not in the city, not in Newport, where the other railroad magnates were erecting their marble palaces, but in the hills of Connecticut, on a remote parcel of land he had quietly acquired through a shell company. He hired architects, 3 of them, in sequence, each fired after clashing with Cornelius over the design. He brought in engineers, masons, craftsmen from as far as India and Egypt. He oversaw every detail personally, often working through the night by lamplight, sketching symbols and floor plans in notebooks he never let anyone else see. The construction took 5 years. The cost was staggering, estimated at over $3 million, equivalent to nearly $100 million today. But money was no object. Cornelius Olcott was building his temple. The Olcott Estate was completed in 1894, and even by Gilded Age standards, it was strange. The main house sprawled across 40 rooms, but it didn't sprawl logically. Hallways turned at odd angles. Staircases led to blank walls. Doors opened onto rooms that seemed too small or too large for their stated purpose. The architecture was a collision of styles: Gothic spires, Moorish arches, Egyptian columns, all woven together in a way that felt deliberate but unreadable, like a sentence written in a language you almost recognize. The exterior was faced in pale limestone, imported from quarries in Indiana, and the effect in certain light was almost spectral. The house seemed to glow. The grounds covered 200 acres, with formal gardens, a man-made lake, and a private observatory built into the highest point of the property. That observatory wasn't for casual stargazing. It was equipped with one of the most advanced telescopes available in the 1890s, and Cornelius spent countless nights there, charting celestial movements, taking notes in cipher. But it was the inside of the house that truly revealed his obsession. The entrance hall was dominated by a massive mosaic floor, inlaid with symbols that scholars would later identify as a mixture of theosophical emblems, alchemical signs, and Sanskrit characters. The grand staircase was flanked by statues, not Greek gods or Roman emperors, but figures from Eastern religions: Buddha, Shiva, Zoroaster. In the main drawing room, the ceiling was painted to resemble a mandala, a vast circular pattern of interconnected geometric forms that seemed to shift and pulse if you stared at it too long. Guests were rare. Cornelius and Eleanor entertained, but selectively, and those who did visit often left with strange stories. One society columnist, writing under a pseudonym, described a dinner party where the host excused himself between courses and didn't return for over an hour. The guests sat in uncomfortable silence, picking at their dessert, until Cornelius reappeared, disheveled, distracted, offering no explanation. Another guest recalled that certain rooms in the house were always locked, and that when she asked about them, Eleanor simply changed the subject. Because Cornelius hadn't built this mansion to impress his peers. He'd built it as a machine, a physical structure designed to channel spiritual energy, to align with cosmic forces, to bring him closer to the hidden masters he believed governed reality. Let's be clear about what that means. In the late 19th century, theosophy was a serious movement among certain educated elites. Founded by Helena Blavatsky, it claimed to synthesize Eastern religions, Western mysticism, and scientific inquiry into a unified system of truth. Theosophists believed in the existence of ascended masters, enlightened beings who guided humanity from a higher plane. They believed in reincarnation karma and the idea that secret knowledge had been passed down through the ages by initiates who understood the hidden laws of the universe. To many, this was nonsense. To others, it was dangerous. But to Cornelius Olcott, it was everything. He became a devoted member of the Theosophical Society, attending meetings, corresponding with Blavatsky herself, and donating large sums to fund the movement's publications and outreach. But he wanted more than membership. He wanted direct contact. He wanted to build a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where he could receive teachings, perform rituals, and perhaps, just perhaps, transcend the material limits of his existence. So he designed the estate accordingly. The layout of the house followed a sacred geometry, with certain rooms positioned to align with astronomical events. The observatory wasn't just for looking at stars, it was a ritual space, where Cornelius would time his meditations to planetary transits and lunar phases. The underground chambers, accessed through a hidden staircase in the library, were constructed with acoustics in mind. Chanting and vocal tones would resonate in strange, amplified ways, creating effects that participants described as disorienting, even transcendent. And then there were the symbols, carved into mantels, etched into doorframes, hidden in the patterns of wallpaper and tile. Symbols everywhere. Some were borrowed from established systems. The ankh, the pentagram, the lotus. Others were Cornelius's own inventions, unique glyphs that he claimed had been revealed to him in dreams or meditations. He kept detailed records of what each symbol meant, how they should be arranged, and what purposes they served. Those records were in the hidden room behind the false wall. But let's step back for a moment. Let's think about what this actually looked like day to day. You're a servant in the Olcott household. You wake before dawn in the staff quarters, a separate building, predictably less ornate. You enter the main house through the service entrance, walking corridors that smell of linseed oil and old stone. You're not allowed in certain parts of the house. You've been told this explicitly. The east wing, the observatory, the basement levels. Those areas are for the master alone, or for the master and his guests, though you're not sure who those guests are because they arrive late at night and you never see their faces. You dust the drawing room, careful not to disturb the objects on the mantelpiece. A bronze incense burner shaped like a dragon, a small statue of a multi-armed deity, a leather-bound book with no title. You polish the mosaic floor in the entrance hall, tracing the strange symbols with your cloth, wondering what they mean and whether you should even be touching them. One evening, you're cleaning the hallway outside the library when you hear voices. Low, rhythmic, almost like singing, but not quite. The sound is coming from below you. You freeze. You've heard rumors. The other staff whisper about chanting, about lights flickering under doors, about the smell of incense drifting up from rooms that shouldn't exist. You finish your work quickly and leave. You don't ask questions. You can't afford to. The Olcott household pays well, better than most estates in the area, and jobs are scarce. So you keep your head down, you do your work, and you try not to think about what's happening in the parts of the house you'll never see. But here's the thing, every system, no matter how secret, requires people. And people talk. By the late 1890s, whispers about the Olcott Estate had begun to spread beyond the household staff. Neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the woods at night, processions of robed figures walking single file toward the mansion. A local minister claimed that Cornelius had tried to recruit him into a brotherhood of seekers, offering a substantial donation to the church in exchange for his participation. The minister declined and later told his congregation that he had been shown texts that contradicted Christian teachings, that spoke of gods and planes of existence far outside the biblical framework. The story made its way into a regional newspaper, anonymously submitted, and though the article was vague and sensational, it planted a seed. People began to ask questions. Who exactly was Cornelius Olcott hosting at his estate? What were they doing there? And why was he so obsessed with secrecy? Cornelius, for his part, seemed unconcerned. He continued his work with the Theosophical Society, even as that organization fractured into competing factions following Blavatsky's death in 1891. He funded expeditions to Tibet and India, searching for ancient manuscripts and relics. He corresponded with mystics, occultists, and scholars from around the world, building a personal library that rivaled those of major universities. His letters, many of which survived in archives, reveal a man utterly convinced that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that he was close to unlocking truths that would reshape human understanding. But his business empire was starting to crack. The railroad industry in the 1890s was volatile. Overexpansion, labor strikes, and financial panics created a landscape where fortunes could evaporate almost overnight. Cornelius had always been a sharp operator, but his attention was divided. He spent more time at the estate than at his office. He missed key meetings. He made uncharacteristic errors in judgment, trusting the wrong partners, ignoring warning signs. In 1897, one of his major rail lines defaulted on its bonds. Investors panicked. Cornelius scrambled to cover the losses, liquidating assets, calling in favors. He managed to stabilize the situation, but the damage to his reputation was done. Wall Street began to see him as erratic, distracted, no longer the ruthless, calculating magnate he had once been. His wife, Eleanor, tried to intervene. By all accounts, she was a practical, intelligent woman who had supported Cornelius through the early years of his rise, but had grown increasingly alarmed by his obsessions. She urged him to step back, to delegate more, to focus on the family. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and she worried about what kind of inheritance they would receive, not just financially, but reputationally. But Cornelius wouldn't listen, or couldn't. He was too deep into his quest, too convinced that he was on the brink of something monumental. He told Eleanor that material wealth was temporary, that what he was pursuing was eternal. She stopped arguing with him. Instead, she began quietly moving money into accounts he didn't control, securing property in her own name, preparing for a future she could see coming even if he couldn't. And then, in 1901, the federal government came knocking. The Interstate Commerce Commission had been investigating several railroad companies for anti-competitive practices, rate fixing, and fraudulent bookkeeping. Cornelius's companies were on the list. Investigators requested records. Cornelius stalled. They requested more records. He provided some, but not all. The investigators grew suspicious. Why was he being so evasive? What was he hiding? In early 1902, they obtained a warrant and arrived at his New York office with federal marshals. What they found was chaos. Incomplete ledgers, missing documents, evidence of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been used to funnel money away from the railroad operations. Some of that money had gone to pay debts. Some had been invested in legitimate ventures. But a significant portion, millions of dollars, had simply vanished. Or rather, it had gone to Connecticut, to the estate, to the construction of a mansion that had cost far more than Cornelius had ever publicly admitted, and to payments made to individuals and organizations whose purposes were unclear. The investigators wanted to know, where did the money go and why? Cornelius refused to cooperate. He invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. He hired expensive lawyers who filed motion after motion, delaying the process. But the pressure was mounting. The press got wind of the investigation, and suddenly the reclusive railroad magnate was front-page news. Mystic millionaire under federal scrutiny. Olcott's secret society. Railroad funds diverted to occult activities. The articles were lurid, speculative, but not entirely inaccurate. The public was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. This was the Gilded Age, an era when the wealthy were both celebrated and deeply resented, when the gap between rich and poor was a chasm, and when any hint of moral or financial impropriety could spark outrage. Cornelius Olcott, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. And then, in the summer of 1903, everything collapsed. One of Cornelius's business partners, a man named Howard Breckinridge, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity. Breckinridge had been involved in the shell companies and knew where the money had gone. He provided detailed testimony, backed up with documents, showing that Cornelius had systematically diverted railroad profits into personal accounts, which were then used to fund the estate, the Theosophical Society, and payments to individuals described only as spiritual advisors and initiates. The legal case against Cornelius became airtight. He was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. His assets were frozen. His railroad companies were placed under federal oversight. And the Olcott Estate, that strange temple on the hill, was suddenly at the center of a national scandal. Cornelius retreated to the mansion. He stopped appearing in public. He gave no interviews. His lawyers issued statements on his behalf, denying wrongdoing, claiming that the charges were politically motivated, that his religious beliefs were being persecuted. But the tide had turned. The man who had once moved markets and dined with presidents was now a pariah, hiding behind locked gates while his empire crumbled around him. Eleanor, seeing the inevitable, filed for legal separation and took the children to Boston. She told the press that she had tried to help her husband, but that he had become consumed by delusions. It was a carefully worded statement, designed to protect the family's remaining assets and reputation. It also severed her from Cornelius, both legally and socially. He was alone now, alone in his mansion, with his symbols and his secrets and his certainty that the world simply didn't understand. The trial began in the spring of 1904 in a federal courthouse in Manhattan. It was a spectacle. Reporters packed the gallery. Sketch artists captured Cornelius's gaunt face, his hollow eyes, the way he seemed to shrink into his tailored suit. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. Charts showing money flows, testimony from accountants, letters and telegrams, proving that Cornelius had knowingly diverted funds. Breckinridge took the stand and described meetings where Cornelius had explicitly stated his intention to use railroad profits for higher purposes, claiming that the material success of the company was secondary to the spiritual mission he was undertaking. The defense tried to paint Cornelius as a visionary, a man whose unconventional beliefs were being criminalized simply because they didn't fit societal norms. They called witnesses who testified to his philanthropy, his support of the arts and education, his generosity to certain causes. But it wasn't enough. The jury saw a man who had stolen from his own company, who had betrayed investors and shareholders, who had put his personal obsessions above his legal and fiduciary responsibilities. The verdict came in June, guilty on 7 counts of fraud and embezzlement. Sentencing was delayed while the defense filed appeals, but the damage was done. Cornelius's remaining business interests collapsed. Creditors seized properties. The railroads were sold off in pieces to rival companies. The fortune that had taken decades to build evaporated in a matter of months. And through it all, Cornelius said almost nothing. He gave one brief statement to the press, standing on the courthouse steps, his voice barely audible over the shouts of reporters. They cannot judge what they do not understand. The work continues. The work will always continue. Then he turned and walked away, flanked by his lawyers, and disappeared into a waiting car. He returned to the estate. He would spend the rest of his life there. But let's pause here and think about what was happening inside that house during those final years. Because this is where the story gets truly dark, not in the legal battles or the public scandal, but in the private unraveling of a man who had built everything on a foundation that couldn't hold. The staff was gone. Most had been dismissed when the money ran out. A few remained unpaid out of loyalty or pity. But they eventually left too. The estate, which had required dozens of people to maintain, began to decay. The gardens overgrew. The lake filled with algae and fallen leaves. Windows went unwashed, and the pale limestone that had once glowed now looked gray and lifeless. Cornelius lived alone in a 40-room mansion, moving through it like a ghost. He still performed his rituals. Neighbors reported seeing candlelight in the observatory late at night, and occasionally the faint sound of chanting drifting down the hill. But there were no more gatherings, no more robe processions. The secret society, if it had ever truly existed beyond Cornelius's imagination, had abandoned him. He kept writing. That much we know from the journals found later, some in the library, some in the hidden room. The entries from this period are fragmented, increasingly incoherent. He wrote about failures, experiments that hadn't worked, meditations that had revealed nothing, symbols that had lost their power. He wrote about betrayal, not by individuals, but by the universe itself, as if the hidden masters he had devoted his life to reaching had turned away, indifferent to his suffering. And he wrote about the house, specifically about things happening in the house that he couldn't explain. Doors opening on their own, footsteps in empty rooms, shadows that moved against the direction of the light. At first, he interpreted these as signs, proof that he was succeeding, that the veil was thinning. But over time, the tone of the entries changed. He began to describe the phenomena as hostile, invasive. He wrote about sealing off certain rooms, about performing banishing rituals, about feeling watched. Whether any of this was real, or whether it was the product of isolation, stress, and possible mental decline, we can't know. But it's clear that by the end, Cornelius Olcott was living in a prison of his own design, haunted not by ghosts, but by the consequences of his choices. In 1908, a local doctor was called to the estate by a delivery boy who had been dropping off supplies and noticed that several days' worth of packages were piling up on the front steps. The doctor found Cornelius in the library, collapsed in a chair, barely conscious. He was malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from what the doctor described as complete nervous exhaustion. He was taken to a private sanatorium in upstate New York, where he remained for several months. When he was released, he didn't return to the estate. Instead, he took a small apartment in New York City, living under an assumed name, supported by a modest trust that Eleanor had reluctantly agreed to maintain. He spent his days reading, writing letters that were never sent, and occasionally visiting occult bookshops where he was no longer recognized. He died in 1912, at the age of 61, of heart failure. The obituary in the New York Times was brief and cold, a single paragraph noting his former prominence and his later disgrace. There was no mention of the estate, the symbols, the hidden rooms. Just another fallen tycoon, forgotten by history. But the mansion remained. Eleanor had no interest in it. The property was still technically in Cornelius's name, tangled in legal disputes with creditors and tax authorities. No one wanted to buy it. It was too strange, too expensive to maintain, and too infamous. So it sat empty and locked, slowly surrendering to the weather and the woods. Over the decades, it became a local legend. Teenagers dared each other to climb the fence and peek through the windows. Occultists and conspiracy theorists made pilgrimages, leaving offerings at the gates, claiming to feel energy or see visions. The town council debated tearing it down, but the cost was prohibitive, and there was no political will to take on the fight. So the Olcott Estate endured, a monument to ambition and delusion, to wealth and waste, to the dangerous belief that enough money and enough will could unlock the secrets of the universe. And inside, in a room that no one had yet found, the documents waited. For most of the 20th century, the Olcott Estate existed in a kind of limbo. Ownership passed through a series of legal entities, banks, holding companies, distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with it. Occasionally, someone would propose a use for the property: a hotel, a private school, a psychiatric facility. None of these plans came to fruition. The mansion was too damaged, too isolated, and too expensive to rehabilitate. It was easier to let it rot. By the 1970s, parts of the roof had collapsed. Water damage had destroyed much of the interior. The grand staircase, once so imposing, was warped and unstable. The mosaic floor in the entrance hall was cracked and overgrown with moss that had somehow found purchase in the gaps between tiles. Animals, raccoons, birds, even a family of foxes, had made homes in the empty rooms. The estate had become a ruin, one of those places that photographers and urban explorers seek out for its eerie, decayed beauty. But there were still people who cared. Historians, architects, preservationists, people who understood that, for all its strangeness, the Olcott Estate represented something significant. It was a time capsule of the Gilded Age, yes, but also a record of a particular kind of spiritual hunger that had gripped America at the turn of the century. Theosophy, spiritualism, the fascination with the occult. These weren't fringe movements. They were mainstream or close to it, and they shaped the culture in ways we often forget. In 1998, A preservation group called the Northeast Historical Architecture Foundation acquired the estate through a complicated arrangement involving grants, private donations, and tax incentives. Their goal was modest: stabilize the structure, prevent further decay, and document what remained before it was lost forever. They weren't trying to restore the mansion to its former glory. That would have cost tens of millions of dollars. But they wanted to save it from complete destruction. The work began in 2001. Teams of contractors, engineers, and historians moved in, carefully shoring up walls, replacing sections of roof, and cataloging the contents of the house. And that's when they started finding things. Books, hundreds of them, still in the library despite decades of exposure to the elements. Most were damaged beyond repair, but some had survived, protected by oilcloth wrappings or locked cabinets. Titles on alchemy, astrology, Eastern philosophy, Western mysticism, an entire occult education preserved in decaying leather bindings. Artifacts, too. Ritual objects. Bronze bowls engraved with Sanskrit prayers, a ceremonial sword with a handle carved from bone, incense burners shaped like mythological creatures. Clothing. Robes made of silk and velvet, some plain, others embroidered with symbols that matched those carved into the house itself. And maps. Dozens of maps showing the estate, the surrounding area, and in some cases, star charts annotated with dates and times, clearly used for planning astronomical observations or rituals. But the most significant discovery came in the East Wing, in a section of a house that had been closed off by a collapsed staircase and was only accessible after weeks of careful demolition and reinforcement. One of the workers, a carpenter named Michael Torrance, was removing sections of rotten paneling in a second-floor hallway when he noticed something odd. The wall, behind the paneling, didn't match the others. It was newer, different materials, constructed with less skill. He called over the site supervisor, and together they examined it. The conclusion was clear. This wasn't original to the house. It had been added later, probably by Cornelius himself, to conceal something. They got permission to break through. What they found was a door, painted over so many times that it was nearly invisible. It had no handle, no lock, just a latch on the inside, inaccessible unless you removed the false wall. Beyond the door was a room, 15 feet by 20. No windows. A single electric bulb hanging from the ceiling, long dead. And inside, filing cabinets, 3 of them, made of oak and still intact. Shelves lining the walls, holding leather-bound journals, stacks of correspondence, ledgers, and rolled maps secured with twine. A small desk and chair, both covered in dust, so thick it looked like fabric. And on the desk, an open journal, as if Cornelius had simply stood up, walked out, and never returned. The preservation team documented everything. They photographed the room from every angle, cataloged each item, and carefully transported the materials to a climate-controlled facility for analysis. It took months. What they found was extraordinary and deeply troubling. The journals contained detailed records of Cornelius's activities from roughly 1895 to 1907. Not just his business dealings, though those were there, names, dates, transactions that shed new light on the financial crimes he'd been convicted of, but also his spiritual work. Descriptions of rituals performed in the underground chambers. Notes on experiments with sound, light, and architecture, attempting to create environments that would facilitate altered states of consciousness. And correspondence, letters to and from people all over the world, some of whom were known figures in occult circles, others who were completely unknown. But here's where it gets complicated. Some of those letters implicated people who were still alive, or whose descendants were still prominent. Businessmen, politicians, academics, individuals who had been part of Cornelius's network and who had, presumably, hoped that their involvement would remain buried with him. The letters described financial contributions, participation in rituals, and in some cases, explicit endorsements of Cornelius's vision for a new spiritual order. There were also documents related to the federal investigation, drafts of testimony that Cornelius had prepared but never delivered, lists of people he considered traitors, and notes suggesting that he believed the prosecution was part of a larger conspiracy to silence him. Whether that belief had any basis in reality, or whether it was pure paranoia, is still debated. And then there were the maps. Not geographical maps, but symbolic maps. Diagrams showing how the estate's rooms and chambers were interconnected, not physically, but energetically. Cornelius had drawn lines between spaces, labeled them with alchemical symbols, and annotated them with phrases like optimal for invocation or threshold point, use caution. He had designed the house as a kind of circuit, a structure through which forces could flow, and he had documented every detail. The preservation team handed everything over to the state archives, along with a recommendation that the materials be made available to researchers. And for the most part, they were. Scholars have written papers on the journals, the letters, the maps. The story of Cornelius Olcott has been re-evaluated, contextualized, analyzed. But not all of it was released. This is where the story becomes murky, and where we move from documented history into the realm of rumor, suppression, and unanswered questions. According to multiple sources, historians who worked with the preservation team, archivists at the state repository, even some local journalists, a portion of the materials found in the hidden room was never made public. Officially, the explanation is bureaucratic. Ongoing legal disputes over privacy, questions of ownership, sensitivity around identifying individuals mentioned in the documents. But that explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The legal issues surrounding the estate had been largely resolved by the time the room was discovered. Cornelius's descendants had long since renounced any claim to his legacy. The people mentioned in the letters were, in most cases, long dead. So why the secrecy? Some believe the withheld documents contain evidence of criminal activity beyond what Cornelius was convicted of, perhaps connections to organized crime or financial schemes that implicated institutions still operating today. Others think the materials reveal embarrassing truths about prominent families, the kind of truths that money and influence can suppress even a century later. But there's another theory, one that's harder to dismiss than it should be. What if the documents contain something that challenges our understanding of what Cornelius was actually doing in that house? Here's what we know. Cornelius wasn't just a dilettante playing with occult ideas for fun. He was methodical, disciplined, and deeply committed. He spent years studying under teachers, some legitimate scholars, others charlatans, but all of them part of a broader ecosystem of esoteric knowledge that existed at the margins of mainstream society. He built the estate according to principles that, while strange to us, were internally consistent and carefully executed. And he documented everything. So when people suggest that the hidden documents might reveal something genuinely inexplicable, evidence of phenomena that can't be easily rationalized, experiments that produced results Cornelius himself didn't fully understand, it's not entirely absurd. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time when the boundaries between science, religion, and mysticism were more fluid than they are now. People believed, sincerely, that consciousness, energy, and matter could be manipulated in ways that mainstream science hadn't yet discovered. And Cornelius had the resources, the knowledge, and the obsessive focus to push those boundaries farther than most. Consider this. In one of the journals that was released, Cornelius describes an event that took place in the underground chamber in 1902. He and a small group, he doesn't name them, were performing a ritual intended to open a channel of communication. The details are vague, but he writes that during the ritual, a sound began that none of them were producing. He describes it as a low hum, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The sound grew louder, and with it came a sensation of pressure, as if the air in the room was compressing. The candles flickered and went out, even though there was no wind. And then, for just a moment, Cornelius claims, the darkness was broken by a light, not from any source he could identify, but a glow that seemed to emerge from the stone itself. The entry ends abruptly. The next one, dated several days later, simply says, "We will not attempt that again. The risk is too great." Now, there are plenty of rational explanations for what Cornelius described. Acoustic resonance. The underground chambers were designed with strange acoustics, and certain frequencies could produce unusual effects. Psychological suggestion. If a group of people expect something to happen, they're more likely to perceive it. Hallucination brought on by incense, sleep deprivation, or even accidental poisoning from materials used in the rituals. But here's the unsettling part. Cornelius wasn't writing for an audience. These were private journals, never meant to be published. He had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate. And yet, the tone of that entry is different from the others. There's fear in it and uncertainty, emotions that are rare in his writing. Whatever happened in that chamber, it affected him deeply. So what if the hidden documents contain more entries like that one? What if they describe other experiments, other phenomena, things that resist easy explanation? And what if the decision to withhold them wasn't about protecting reputations or avoiding legal trouble, but about something else, about not wanting to legitimize or publicize ideas that might attract the wrong kind of attention? It's a troubling thought. But it's not the only explanation, and maybe not even the most likely. Sometimes secrets are kept simply because institutions are cautious, because no one wants to be responsible for releasing something controversial, because it's easier to lock things away than to deal with the consequences of disclosure. But the fact remains, there are documents from the Olcott Estate that the public has never seen, and no one in an official capacity will say exactly why. Meanwhile, the estate itself continues to exist, though just barely. The preservation work stabilized the structure, but funding ran out before any real restoration could take place. The foundation that acquired the property eventually transferred ownership to a private buyer in 2007, real estate developer who promised to turn it into a boutique hotel or event space. That never happened. The developer went bankrupt during the financial crisis, and the estate changed hands again, this time to an LLC registered in Delaware, with ownership details obscured by layers of corporate anonymity. The house sits empty. The gates remain locked. Occasionally, maintenance crews are seen on the property, trimming overgrowth or boarding up windows, but there's no sign of active development. Locals assume it's being held as an investment, waiting for the market to shift or for someone with the resources and vision to take on such a massive project. But there are also rumors. People who live near the estate report seeing lights in the windows at night. Not the steady glow of electric lights, but flickering, moving, like candles. Some have heard sounds, music, or chanting, though it's always distant and hard to place. These reports are dismissed as imagination, trespassers, or natural explanations. But they persist. And then there's the question that no one seems to want to ask directly. Who owns the Olcott Estate now, and what are they doing with it? Let's talk about what it means to own a place like this. Not financially, though that's part of it, but symbolically, psychologically. Because the Olcott Estate isn't just a piece of real estate. It's a monument to a man's obsession, a physical manifestation of beliefs that most people find absurd or unsettling. To own it is to inherit that legacy, whether you want to or not. The current owner, whoever they are, has gone to great lengths to remain anonymous. The LLC that holds the title is a shell registered to a law firm in Delaware that specializes in privacy for high net worth clients. Public records show no individual names, no board members, no clear connection to any identifiable person or organization. This level of opacity is unusual, even for real estate transactions involving the wealthy. Some have speculated that the buyer is a collector of esoteric artifacts and properties, someone who sees the estate as a kind of historical trophy. There are people like that, wealthy eccentrics who acquire occult objects, haunted houses, places with dark histories, not to restore or use them, but simply to possess them. To own something that no one else can have, something that carries weight and meaning beyond its material value. Others believe the buyer is affiliated with a modern occult or mystical organization, perhaps even a successor to the Theosophical Society or one of its offshoots. The idea is that the estate is still seen as sacred or at least significant, and that it's being preserved or even used by people who share Cornelius's worldview. The reports of lights and sounds could support this theory. If rituals are being performed there, they would likely happen at night, in secrecy, by people who understand the symbolism and history of the place. But there's a darker possibility. What if the estate is being kept locked and hidden not because it's valuable, but because it's dangerous? Not in a supernatural sense, though we'll get to that, but in a very practical way. The hidden documents, the symbols, the design of the house itself. What if they contain information that someone doesn't want disseminated? Information about power structures, financial systems, or networks of influence that are still relevant today. Consider the letters that were found in the hidden room. We know that some of them implicated people in Cornelius's orbit, individuals who participated in his network, financially or spiritually. What we don't know is who those people were or what they did with the knowledge and connections they gained through their association with him. Cornelius corresponded with businessmen, politicians, academics, artists, people who went on to shape the 20th century in various ways. What if some of those connections led to systems or institutions that still exist? And what if the evidence of their origins is sitting in a file cabinet in Connecticut? It's a kind of thing that sounds like a conspiracy theory until you remember that history is full of actual conspiracies, networks of influence and power that operated in secret and shaped events in ways that only became clear decades later. The Gilded Age was rife with this. Backroom deals, monopolies, political machines. The mechanisms of power were often hidden, and the men who wielded them were very good at covering their tracks. Cornelius Olcott was part of that world. And even though his fortune collapsed, even though he died in obscurity, the connections he made, the systems he participated in, didn't necessarily die with him. So maybe the estate is being kept under wraps not to protect Cornelius's legacy, but to protect someone else's. Maybe the current owner isn't a collector or a mystic, but a gatekeeper, someone whose job is to make sure that certain things stay buried. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that's hardest to take seriously, but also hardest to completely dismiss, maybe the estate itself is the issue. Maybe there's something about the physical structure, the way it was designed and built, that makes it genuinely problematic. Let's go back to what Cornelius was trying to do. He believed that architecture could be used to manipulate spiritual forces, to create environments that were conducive to altered states of consciousness, communication with non-material entities, or even the direct experience of higher planes of reality. Whether or not you believe that's possible, Cornelius certainly did, and he built the estate accordingly. Sacred geometry, specific materials, acoustic properties, symbolic alignments. Every detail was intentional. And if we take him at his word, some of his experiments worked, or at least produced effects that he interpreted as success. The underground chambers, in particular, seem to have been designed as focus points, places where the structure's properties were most concentrated. Now, let's imagine that some of those properties are real. Not in a mystical sense, but in a purely physical one. Sound waves, electromagnetic fields, geological features. There are documented cases of places where natural or architectural factors produce unusual effects on human perception and psychology. Infrasound, for example, at frequencies below the range of human hearing, can cause feelings of unease, dread, or even hallucinations. Certain building materials, when combined in specific ways, can create electromagnetic anomalies. What if Cornelius, through trial and error and obsessive experimentation, stumbled onto something like that? What if the estate, by accident or design, produces effects that are unsettling, disorienting, or even harmful to people who spend time there? That would explain the reports of strange experiences, not as supernatural phenomena, but as the result of the environment itself. It would also explain why the estate might be kept locked and inaccessible. If the building is genuinely unsafe, not because of structural damage, but because of its inherent properties, then the responsible thing to do would be to prevent people from entering. But if that's the case, why not just say so? Why the secrecy, the anonymous ownership, the refusal to release documents? Maybe because acknowledging it would open up too many questions. It would mean admitting that Cornelius wasn't entirely wrong, that his experiments had tangible results, even if he misunderstood what those results were. And that would complicate the narrative of the fallen tycoon, the deluded mystic, the cautionary tale of wealth and obsession. It's easier to let the estate sit locked and forgotten, a puzzle that no one is quite willing to solve. But some people won't let it go. Despite the lock gates and the corporate anonymity, the Olcott Estate has acquired a following. Online forums devoted to paranormal investigation, occult history, and architectural mysteries all have threads about it, some running into hundreds of pages. People share theories, photographs taken from a distance, satellite images analyzed for hidden features. Occasionally, someone claims to have gotten inside, though these accounts are usually vague and lack credible evidence. In 2015, a group of urban explorers attempted to enter the estate at night, equipped with cameras and climbing gear. They documented the attempt on video and posted it online. The footage shows them scaling the perimeter fence, moving through the overgrown grounds, and approaching the house. The windows are boarded up, the doors secured with heavy chains and padlocks. They try to find another way in, a basement entrance, a broken window. But the property has been thoroughly sealed. And then something happens that cuts the expedition short. One of the explorers, a woman named Jess, stops suddenly and refuses to go further. She's visibly distressed, breathing hard, and when her companions ask what's wrong, she can't articulate it. She just says she feels wrong, like something is pressing down on her, and she needs to leave. The others try to reassure her, but she insists, and eventually the group abandons the attempt and retreats. Later, in an interview segment at the end of the video, Jess tries to explain. It wasn't like I saw something or heard something. It was just this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there. Like the place was aware of me and didn't want me inside. I know that sounds insane, but I've done dozens of these explorations, and I've never felt anything like that. The video went semi-viral in niche communities, and predictably, it spawned 1,000 interpretations. Skeptics said it was staged for views, or that Jess had simply psyched herself out after reading too much about the estate's history. Believers took it as confirmation that the house is haunted, cursed, or otherwise spiritually active. But there's a third interpretation, one that doesn't require either fraud or the supernatural, that the estate genuinely produces psychological effects on people who approach it, and that those effects are the result of its design, its history, or both. The power of suggestion is real. If you approach a place believing it to be dark or dangerous, your nervous system responds accordingly. Your perception narrows. You become hypervigilant. Ambiguous stimuli, a shadow, a sound, a shift in temperature, are interpreted through the lens of fear. And the Olcott Estate has a lot of ambiguous stimuli. It's isolated, decaying, visually unsettling. It looks like the kind of place where bad things happened, because bad things did happen there. Not supernatural horrors, but human tragedies. Financial ruin, family collapse, loneliness, obsession, decline. Those stories are written into the architecture, and, on some level, we feel them when we're there. So maybe the estate isn't haunted. Maybe it's just haunted by history, by the weight of what it represents. But that weight is real, and it has power. And if the current owners understand that, if they recognize that the estate functions, intentionally or not, as a kind of psychological trap, then it makes sense that they would keep it locked. Not to protect what's inside, but to protect people from themselves. But let's return to the hidden documents, because that's the unresolved thread, the thing that keeps this story from being neatly closed. In 2019, a researcher named Dr. Evelyn Marsh published a paper in the Journal of American Esoteric History arguing that the withheld materials from the Olcott Estate should be made public. Marsh had spent years studying theosophy and related movements, and she had been granted limited access to some of the released documents. Her paper detailed what she had found, the journals, the letters, the maps, and made a case that the remaining materials were of significant historical value and should not be suppressed for bureaucratic or political reasons. The paper was well-researched and carefully argued, but it received almost no mainstream attention. A few academic journals cited it. A few bloggers and podcasters discussed it. But the State Archives, the institution holding the documents, issued no response. Requests for comment went unanswered. Freedom of Information Act requests were filed and denied, citing exemptions for privacy and ongoing legal matters. Dr. Marsh tried a different approach. She reached out to the current owner of the estate, using what little information she had, the LLC name, the law firm, and sent letters requesting access to the property and any private archives that might still be there. She never received a reply. In a follow-up essay published on her personal blog, Marsh wrote, "The silence is the most telling response. If the materials were truly innocuous, there would be no reason to withhold them. If they were genuinely dangerous, containing, say, instructions for illegal activities, law enforcement would have intervened. The fact that they exist in a kind of bureaucratic limbo suggests something else, that they are embarrassing, complicating, or otherwise inconvenient to someone with the power to keep them hidden." She's probably right. But that doesn't get us any closer to knowing what's actually in those files. Here's what we can infer based on the documents that were released and the context of Cornelius's life. The hidden materials likely contain more detailed descriptions of his rituals and experiments, possibly including outcomes that he considered significant or troubling. They probably include correspondence with individuals whose names would be recognizable, either because they were famous in their own right or because their descendants are. They might contain financial records that reveal more about where the diverted railroad money went and who benefited from it. And they could include personal writings, confessions, reflections, admissions that paint a more complete and less flattering picture of Cornelius than the one we already have. What they probably don't contain is anything genuinely supernatural or scientifically revolutionary. If Cornelius had discovered some hidden truth about the universe, some repeatable method for accessing other planes of reality, it would have shown up somewhere else. Other members of his circle would have pursued it. The Theosophical Society would have publicized it. The fact that nothing like that happened suggests that whatever Cornelius experienced, it was subjective, personal, and ultimately not transferable. But subjective doesn't mean unimportant, and personal doesn't mean irrelevant. Because what the Olcott Estate represents, what all of this represents, is a very human story about the limits of knowledge, the dangers of obsession, and the ways that wealth and power can be used to pursue visions that are beautiful, absurd, and ultimately destructive. Let's step back and ask the broader question. What does the Olcott Estate tell us about America, about wealth, about the human need for meaning? The Gilded Age was a time of extremes. Unprecedented industrial growth, staggering fortunes, massive inequality. The men who built the railroads, the steel mills, the banks, they didn't just accumulate money. They accumulated power, influence, and the belief that they were shaping the future. But underneath that confidence was anxiety. Because for all their wealth, for all their control over the material world, they couldn't escape the fundamental questions. What does it all mean? What happens when we die? Is this life, this accumulation, this competition, all there is? Some turned to religion, others to philosophy, and some, like Cornelius Olcott, turned to esotericism, to the promise that there were hidden truths, secret systems, ways of accessing realities beyond the mundane. This wasn't foolishness, or at least it wasn't only foolishness. The late 19th century was a time when science and spirituality were not yet fully separated. People believed that consciousness, will, and intention could be studied scientifically, that the line between mind and matter was permeable. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, included scientists, philosophers, and intellectuals who took claims of telepathy, clairvoyance, and communication with the dead seriously. They designed experiments, collected data, and published findings in peer-reviewed journals. Theosophy was part of that ecosystem. It claimed to be a synthesis, a reconciliation of Eastern and Western thought, of ancient wisdom and modern insight. And for people like Cornelius, who had the education to engage with complex ideas and the money to pursue them without constraint, it was intoxicating. But here's the problem. Esotericism, by its nature, resists verification. Its truths are always hidden, accessible only to initiates, described in language that outsiders can't penetrate. That makes it immune to falsification, but it also makes it dangerous, because it allows people to build entire belief systems on foundations that are never tested, never challenged, never exposed to the friction of reality. Cornelius built his temple. He performed his rituals. He believed he was on the verge of enlightenment, of contact with higher beings, of knowledge that would transform not just his own life, but the world. And in the end, what did he achieve? He bankrupted himself. He alienated his family. He spent his final years alone in a sanatorium, writing letters that no one would read. The mansion he left behind is a monument to that failure. Not because esotericism is inherently false, though you're free to believe that, but because he pursued it in a way that ignored the real, material consequences of his actions. He diverted money that wasn't his. He neglected responsibilities. He prioritized his inner vision over the people who depended on him. And that's the real tragedy of the Olcott Estate. Not that Cornelius believed in strange things, but that he let those beliefs consume him. But let's also acknowledge something uncomfortable. We're fascinated by this story precisely because Cornelius was wealthy. If he had been a poor man obsessed with the occult, performing rituals in a rented room, we wouldn't care. He would be dismissed as a crank, a tragic figure maybe, but not someone worth a documentary or a deep investigation. It's the mansion that makes the story. The 40 rooms, the observatory, the underground chambers. The sheer scale of his obsession, made possible by his fortune. We're drawn to the spectacle of it, the excess, the idea that someone could pour millions of dollars into a vision that most people would consider delusional. And in that sense, the Olcott Estate is very much a Gilded Age story. It's about what happens when you remove the constraints, financial, social, practical, that keep most people tethered to reality. It's about the belief that money can buy not just things, but truth. And it's about the wreckage that results when that belief is tested and found wanting. But here's the twist. We haven't learned the lesson. We still celebrate billionaires who pursue grandiose visions, space colonies, life extension, artificial intelligence, with the same fervor that Cornelius pursued his hidden masters. We tell ourselves that these new visions are different, that they're grounded in science and engineering rather than mysticism. But are they? Or are they just the esoteric beliefs of our own era, dressed up in modern language? Consider the rhetoric around some of these projects. The claims that we're on the verge of solving death, of merging with machines, of transcending biological limits. The promise that technology will unlock new planes of existence, virtual realities, simulated worlds, digital immortality. These are not scientific predictions. They're articles of faith, and the people promoting them are investing billions, building their own temples, convinced that they're on the verge of something transformative. Maybe they're right. Maybe some of these visions will come to pass. But maybe, like Cornelius, they're building monuments to their own obsessions, and in 50 years we'll look back at their estates, whether physical or corporate, and ask the same questions. What did it cost? Who paid? And what does it tell us about the dangers of unchecked wealth and unchecked ambition? The Olcott Estate is a warning, but it's one we don't seem interested in heeding. And that brings us back to the house itself, still standing on that hill in Connecticut, still locked and hidden. What should be done with it? Some argue it should be fully restored and opened as a museum, a place where people can confront the strange, uncomfortable history it represents. Others say it should be torn down, that it's too damaged, too expensive, and too laden with negative associations to be worth saving. A few, mostly in occult circles, believe it should be left alone, neither restored nor destroyed, allowed to decay naturally as a kind of monument to impermanence. But none of these things are happening. The estate remains in limbo, owned by shadows, accessible to no one, its secrets still sealed behind locked gates and withheld documents. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe the most appropriate fate for a house built on secrets is to become a secret itself, a place that exists more in imagination and rumor than in reality. But that doesn't satisfy us, does it? We want resolution. We want to know what's in those hidden documents, what's behind those locked doors. We want the story to have an ending. So let's give it one. Imagine this. The documents are released. Not all at once, and not without controversy, but eventually, through a combination of legal pressure, public interest, and the simple passage of time, the withheld materials from the Olcott Estate are made available. What do they reveal? More of what we already suspected. Detailed ritual instructions, complex, bizarre, but ultimately just a product of a brilliant mind trying to systematize the unsystematizable. Letters implicating prominent figures. Embarrassing, yes, but not criminal. Just evidence that the social networks of the powerful have always included people with strange beliefs. Financial records showing where the money went, into construction, into payments to artisans and mystics, into a vision that consumed everything. And personal writings. Lots of them. Cornelius reflecting on his failures, his doubts, his creeping realization that the hidden masters he sought were never going to answer, that the architecture he built couldn't force enlightenment, that he had sacrificed everything for a communion that would never come. In one entry, dated 1906, he writes, "I built this house to be a temple, a place where the material and the spiritual could meet. But I see now that I was building a prison. The walls I raised to keep the world out also kept me in. The symbols I carved to channel divine forces became chains. I thought I was ascending, but I was only descending, into isolation, into obsession, into a kind of madness that I mistook for clarity." It's heartbreaking in a way, because despite everything, the fraud, the selfishness, the ruin he caused, Cornelius was searching for something real. He wanted meaning. He wanted transcendence. He wanted to believe that there was more to existence than balance sheets and board meetings, that consciousness extended beyond the skull, that the universe was alive with intention and intelligence. He was wrong about the methods. He was wrong about the costs. But was he wrong about the search itself? That's the question the Olcott Estate leaves us with. Not whether the occult is real, not whether theosophy or any other esoteric system holds truth, but whether the human hunger for something beyond the material world, something numinous, sacred, profound, is itself a valid pursuit, or whether it's a trap that leads only to delusion and harm. There's no easy answer, because history gives us examples of both. Mystics and visionaries who genuinely expanded human understanding, who created art and philosophy and movements that enriched the world, and charlatans and obsessives who destroyed themselves and others in pursuit of visions that were never real. Cornelius Olcott was somewhere in between. He wasn't a charlatan. He believed deeply and sincerely. But he also wasn't a visionary, because his vision never produced anything beyond the mansion itself. And the mansion, for all its grandeur and strangeness, is just a building. It doesn't contain hidden truths. It doesn't open doors to other planes. It's stone and wood and glass, shaped by money, and will into a monument to one man's refusal to accept the limits of his existence. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the mansion's value isn't in what it achieved, but in what it represents, a record of ambition, of longing, of the human capacity to dream beyond the boundaries of reason. And maybe that's why it should be preserved, not as a museum to the occult, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that the search for meaning is universal, even when the paths we take are strange, even when they lead us into darkness. As for the house itself, imagine a different future. Imagine the anonymous owner, whoever they are, deciding to open the estate to the public, not as a tourist attraction, but as a place of reflection, where people can walk the halls, see the symbols, stand in the underground chambers, and ask themselves the same questions Cornelius asked. What are we searching for? What are we willing to sacrifice? And when we build our temples, whether they're made of stone or code or rhetoric, what do they reveal about us? The Olcott Estate could be that, a place that doesn't provide answers, but that holds space for questions. Or imagine this, the house is left as it is, locked, sealed, slowly crumbling. But the documents are released and researchers, historians, and artists engage with them, creating new works, essays, films, installations, that carry Cornelius's story forward, that use it as a lens to examine our own obsessions, our own temples. Because the real legacy of the Olcott Estate isn't the building. It's the conversation it forces us to have about power, wealth, belief, and the costs of pursuing visions that others can't see. So here's what we're left with, a mansion on a hill, locked and hidden. Documents that may or may not ever be fully disclosed. A story that's equal parts history, mystery, and cautionary tale. And questions, always questions, about what drives us, what we're willing to destroy in pursuit of something greater, and whether the search itself justifies the wreckage. The gates are still locked. The house is still watching. And somewhere in a climate-controlled archive or a filing cabinet behind a false wall, the final pieces of Cornelius Thaddeus Olcott's story wait to be discovered. Or perhaps they're exactly where they should be, hidden, unresolved, a secret that refuses to give itself up. Because some stories don't end. They just wait. They linger in the shadows, in the spaces between what we know and what we suspect, until someone, maybe you, maybe someone reading this years from now, decides to push through the gates, break down the doors, and confront what's been buried for too long. The Olcott Estate is still there. The questions are still there. And the work, as Cornelius once said, continues.